Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Perceptive Podcast series here on Game Wisdom. We have another great developer cast lined up tonight. My guest is from the studio Butterscotch Shenanigans. I had to make sure to get that name right. And they are
Mouth.
currently yeah, but they are currently working on the upcoming game Crashlands 2. So please welcome from Butterscotch the CEO and founder Adam Koster. How are you doing?
Doing good. Thanks for having me. How are things with you?
Tired and busy and snowing. It's been snowing here on the East Coast for like the
Oh
last few
yeah,
hours.
yeah. We're over in St. Louis, and so we've also got got a solid few inches over the past few days. So I don't know. I
Mhm.
like it if it's gonna be cold. I like it when there's also some snow because then it feels like everything is meshed together properly, and we get to have winter.
Yeah.
So that's tolerable, but also it is very cold, so I'm ready for that to be over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we are nice and snugly inside as we have a lot of design talks to get to. So it is a pleasure to meet you, Adam, and thank you again for coming on to chat about Crashlands.
Yeah, likewise.
hmm For any developers watching, if you let me take a look at your game or like to come on for a chat, we can talk all about game design, game dev. Please reach out. So, since it's your first time on the cast, Adam, for people listening to us, can you talk a little bit about who you are and what is your background when it comes to game dev?
Yeah, so I'm Adam Coster, one of three co-founders of Butterscotch Shenanigans. Started this studio with my brothers back in 2012. Um, we all had a very sideways kind of route into game dev. Mine was particularly sideways. So I started off in the sciences, biology in particular. I got all the way through a PhD in cell and molecular biology. Just didn't touch games at all. I played games growing up. I considered myself a gamer growing up. These days, I don't have the time as much anymore, so it's kind of a bit of a lapsed hobby to an extent. But always loved games growing up, but really, my brothers are the driving force of our studio, and so they started it while I was in grad school. And then when I finished grad school, I just joined them on the adventure to see if we could figure out how to make and sell games, and kind of started to create a role for myself doing it, trying to use the approaches to solving problems that I learned in grad school, and my sort of self-taught programming skills that were at the time frankly negligible, but I didn't know any better, and just started kind of doing stuff. So these days in the studio, I operate as the CEO because somebody's gotta. We're a small team, but somebody has to make sure the business is running. And so I do team management and all that stuff, and all of our biz dev. But my day to day is mostly sort of technical support kind of stuff, and so I build all of our web infrastructure, and anything that does any web related thing is stuff that I am responsible for on the team. And I build lots of tools and software for our team to make sure we can make our games. And then otherwise do some analytics work and that kind of stuff. So that's basically that's been an ever shifting kind of role the whole time, but just depending on the needs of the moment, because of course game dev is this up and down cycle of various needs for various roles, especially on a small team. And our current project has been 4.5 years in the making. And the beginning of that looks very, very different than the end, and so we're constantly kind of retooling and reshuffling what everybody's up to get everything done.
And for people who did not check out Crashlands, what is that about?
Yeah, so Crashlands, original Crashlands, was basically our first and frankly only hit in a meaningful way. It was back in 2016 when we launched it. It was our probably what was it our fourth game, I think. We started in mobile because we figured the barrier to entry there was lower, not for success exactly, but at least for being able to get stuff onto the platform and make stuff that was considered good, right? And that would have been in 2012, basically. So by 2016, we were trying to move into the PC market space, and we did that with original Crashlands. And so it's basically a survival style crafting game, but where the focus is on like joy and having fun rather than on like punishing survival. So we call it Surthrival because it's just about having a really good time. Lots of jokes, kind of a sci-fi setting, and just everything is a pun. It's just a goofy kind of a game. And so that was our first real success that made it so that the studio got to exist. We got to pay ourselves. We got to hire a few people, all that good stuff. We launched another game in 2020, which was Levelhead, but that's unrelated to what we're talking about right now, which is Crashlands 2, which is the sequel to the original Crashlands. And so, really, Crashlands 2 is the game we wish we could have made back when we made the original Crashlands. If we had already known all the stuff that we've learned over the past, to 8 years or 10 years or whatever, then this is what we would have made. And so we're kind of finally getting to build our dream game, really, after just years and years and years of learning how to actually do this stuff by doing it. And so Crashlands 2 is basically an extension of original Crashlands, same kind of core premise, same core gameplay, all that stuff. But everything is just dramatically leveled up, improved, deeper, richer, all that good stuff.
Hmm. And with kind of like, as you said, the survival, well, I have trouble getting that one out.
Surthrival, yeah, it's a tricky one. Yeah.
Like when we talk a lot about kind of the survival craft or that particular genre, like for people who are listening to us right now, they know that I'm not the biggest survival crafter fan. I play again stuff like Don't Starve, some Nautica. I've even done some of like the bigger ones, Valheim. What was the other one that was big? Again, there's been tons and tons of them, but the point about them is that a lot of them tend to very heavily emphasize the survival aspect. That your
Yep.
resources are constantly degrading, your tools are always going to break. You always kind of need to keep doing like tier one grabbing or resource collecting. You always need grass, you always need lumber. With Crashlands 2, and I guess with, and of course being an extension of Crashlands 1, I guess, how do you approach making, again, the surthrival side of things work?
Yeah, yeah. It's tricky, right? Because games are all about trying to provide interesting content over a long period of time.
Hmm.
And when it comes to, I guess if we think of like if we shift genres entirely and think about like a roguelike, right? The way that you do that is you say, well, you're going to keep playing the same game over and over and over again, but we add some kind of meta layer or something to allow it to change and be interesting and dynamic as you go, and just kind of keep trying to kick that kind of content out. Crafting games kind of live in this weird space where everything is disposable, right? Because all crafting games are basically also an RPG in the sense of like you progress through crafting tiers and you keep leveling stuff up,
Hmm.
right? And that means that that early stuff that you found is a component for the later stuff, and its value decreases instantly. The moment you move into a new tier of content, the old tier kind of goes away. And so we have this content treadmill problem in crafting games, period. And so one of the ways that you address that so that there's like a reason to engage with the other stuff is by these kinds of classic survival mechanics where your stuff is degrading all the time, so it has to be repaired so that you can completely get wiped out and have to start from score zero, So basically turning it into a roguelike in essence. So a lot of what you can pull off with those hardcore survival mechanics is essentially converting a crafting game into a roguelike. So you can keep reusing and reworking up the tiers of content so that the content becomes a little less disposable. So that is one of the struggles we had with original Crashlands in particular is as you progress through the game, the kind of the loops become laid bare, right? As you go, you are just kind of throwing away those older tiers of content. And so to make that game, we had to keep on just having new layers of stuff that you keep on working your way through so that you have new interesting stuff to do all the way through the game.
Hmm.
Uh, with Crashlands 2, we recognized that, and because it's one of the common complaints that we got from that game, which is after people play it for like 8 to 12 hours, they starts to feel like, oh, I'm just kind of doing the same thing over again, just everything looks different, right? And so with Crashlands 2, the question was, how do we still have that core vibe of like, we're not trying to punish you for not feeding your human body, or for there's like the classic kind of survival mechanics. We want it to have just a more. It's not even that it's a chill game because there's a hardcore mode and even the base mode is a lot of combat and a lot of fighting stuff, right? So it's an action game really. That's also a crafting game, but it's not a survival game, right? And so trying to find a way to thread all of that was a really interesting challenge, especially needing it to feel like it was the sequel, to the prior game. So all of our approach with that has been how do we figure out how to make everything in the game this time around just feel unique so that stuff becomes less disposable kind of for that reason. And so our approach has been that as you play the game, you're unlocking sort of research nodes, right? That you complete through a combination of like quests and NPCs that you meet and befriend, and you help them out with stuff, and they get happier and they unlock more recipes and stuff, right? But also as you're unlocking things, you unlock new kinds of loot that come from the same resources that you've already interacted with a bunch, so that the same kind of content is constantly evolving. So allowing you to kind of stay in the same area and re-experience it over and over again, but where new stuff happens as you're doing that. And then the stuff that you craft, we have this kind of combination of like your classic upgrade process where you craft a sword of a particular type, and then you can unlock a higher level version of that. You use the lower level one to craft into the new one, and so we still have those kind of classic content treadmill things of like a power curve kind of stuff. But we also have a ton of other elements in the game that are just it's just side grades, right? Where it's like it's a different kind of experience, but not fundamentally better or worse. Um, and so we try to take that approach to all this stuff to make it so that, yeah, there's a power curve and you feel it, and yeah, you feel yourself becoming more powerful. Yeah, you're finding like new parts of the world, you're doing boss fights, you're still doing all of that kind of stuff that like is carrying you through that. But there's also just a lot of more lateral movement and the focus very quickly in the game. Like in the very early game, you're really rapidly kind of becoming more powerful. But as you start to get more into it, we instead try to diversify the kinds of stuff that you're doing. And everything about your power just kind of starts to flatten a bit. So that also the value of like getting that next level of the same item kind of goes down. So you might as well try an adjacent item, right? So instead of using your sword, try some kind of a knuckles weapon or throw spears or whatever, some way to kind of just try something more laterally and see if that can broaden out the experience. So that was kind of our core strategy for trying to take those elements of a crafting game, those elements of a survival game, which is really for us the part that we like about survival games is just you're in some kind of a simulated world and you're interacting with it and it's interesting, right? And so trying to capture all of that stuff in a way that didn't feel like it's a survival game.
Mm-hmm. And I think like to build off of that, like to kind of bring this into like the like automation genre as well, as I think both share kind of similar issues in this respect, is like that kind of like the slowness at the start. Like the last like week or two, I replayed a little bit of Factorio. I tried a few other ones, and going back to Factorio like today, after like playing like Dyson Sphere for so many years, it feels like a snail compared to like everything else. And the same can be said of a lot of survival crafters. That there's always that kind of lull period when you start playing where, okay, I need to go and collect the 5 pieces of wood to build the workbench, to build the axe, to then collect 10 more pieces of wood to build the pickaxe, to get the stone, to then build the house, to then do all this. And then now I can finally start going out and exploring. One of the things that I did enjoy during my brief time playing Power World was just how quickly they kind of just said, okay, put a thing down, done, set your guys to work, go do something. Like, you don't have to worry about all the other stuff. With Crashlands and Crashlands 2, what has been kind of like the approach that you're saying in terms of like the progression, the power curve and progression, like how, I guess, like fast can the player like reasonably like set up in these games?
Yeah. And you feel that in something like Terraria too, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Terraria is one of the games I tend to always come back and try again, and the difference between late game Terraria and coming back on a fresh, new everything is you're walking so slow and it takes so right. And so there is that component of Crashlands, definitely. It has that like slower startup part, right? The way that we try to address that so that it doesn't, because like when I first played Terraria, I actually couldn't play it really. Like I played for like half an hour and I was like, oh, this is too boring. And it wasn't until I came back and played with other people, and so that there was a multiplayer experience, that I could really like get into it. And now the beginning part is actually kind of Zen mode fun, where I'm just like, oh yeah, I know it's coming next. I just gotta get through this period. I'm just gonna relax while I just slowly harvest some things, right? And so with Crashlands 2, our strategy has been make it so that everything else is just interesting already, right? And the core thing that we did, and this was true of original Crashlands 2, was try to marry a story-driven video game with the crafting genre, which there's a reason there's not a lot of that out there is because stories are fairly either linear or you try to make them open world, which is its own whole complicated thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And having that work really well with crafting, which is also like its own kind of like linear but like combinatorial thing, is really really complicated because you don't want things to just feel like they're completely in sync. It
Mm-hmm.
needs to feel like it's kind of a natural, like there's a story unfolding that you're participating in a meaningful way, but you're also just like doing a straight up kind of crafting exploration game.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a lot of what set original Crashlands apart in the genre in the first place was just how much it was you're playing a story, and that allows a lot of the stuff that otherwise is kind of like tedious and boring about the beginning of a relatively complicated crafting game is like we get to offset a lot of that by you're meeting characters who are talking to you about stuff and sending you on quests to go do things, right? So that even when you can't really do much in terms of like bending the world to your will, right? Of you can't harvest all the things yet, it takes a while to do it. You can't craft all the things yet, but you can craft some things. But when there are characters you can go talk to who are pushing you through a story, and there are places you can go that are handcrafted to themselves tell a part of the story that you're then experiencing as you work your way through it, then we get to keep all of that stuff engaging and interesting as we are teaching how to play the game, getting you through the early part of like leveling up, learning the mechanics, being able to do stuff, so that these things come together to make it so that we can lean on the story anytime we're struggling to teach the player something or get them over some kind of a lull or a hump, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a good time for an interesting story beat, right? And so by having like this story, having this kind of progression, having all this sideways stuff, and of course we've got the classic farming and fishing in there as well. So there are all these elements that you can kind of there are enough elements that you can engage with at any given moment. You can kind of be like, I'm gonna do some questing, I'm gonna do some crafting, I'm gonna do some resource. Like you get to choose at any given moment what is the most interesting thing to you, and it's a lot of different kinds of things in any given moment that you can go choose to do. And the net effect is that you're not just like stuck being like, this is taking forever, right? Because you can take a second and go do something else. So that's been kind of like the core strategy is marrying all of those features together, which is why it's also been super hard to make this thing because
Mm-hmm.
there's just so much going on. Balancing it is impossible. Try to even figure out like because it's fairly open worldy this time around, so trying to keep track of when players are going to have accomplished certain tasks and which characters they've met and like all that kind of stuff, and accounting for all of that has been just enormously challenging. So Crashlands 2 has 150,000 words in it, right? So it's a sizable story that's going on in this game. Uh, and part of one of my jobs is to audit all that text and then deal with the localization process. And it's taken me hours upon hours upon hours just to read all of that text in the absence of the game context.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just a lot. There's a lot there, right? And so yeah, so that's been the core strategy is that, and then the other one is just to make the world interesting. And our strategy, especially with Crashlands 2, was to have the world itself be interacting with itself, right? So the first thing you kind of interact with very quickly in the game is a kind of a plant that we call it an explungus, but it's a fungus looking thing that explodes as you might expect, right? And so if you hit it, then you get this like little warning area, and then a short time later it blows up, right? But the player doesn't know that they don't understand any of these cues yet. They've never seen them, right? So it's also part of our onboarding is to kill the player very quickly in a way that doesn't matter that much, right? But that's also a surprise because it's just like a plant. So you just go smack it, and then you see. So you get taught about the 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 system that tells you where damage is going to appear
Mm-hmm.
by interacting with the plant, and then you also quickly observe that the first creatures that you meet, which will eat other plants that are out there, right? So dynamic environment, will also just go take a bite out of those things, and when they do, it also sets them off, right? And so you get to engage with that like you get to engage with these things very early and see it engaging with itself, so that just wandering in the world becomes interesting because stuff is interacting with other stuff. And we also have things like, depending on, we've got like a moon cycles that are going, so you'll have like a red moon night, which then causes like, loot drop rates to kind of change, but also causes some kinds of plants that go into a certain state where they like have like they kind of open up and show a thing, that's normally really rare, but now they're all doing it, So there's just like enough of these kinds of dynamic things going on that the world is just interesting. So it's a little less like when you're playing, say, Terraria, where the world is interesting, but it's limited by being procedurally generated.
Hmm.
And so the world itself isn't doing a lot of storytelling. And so we get to do a lot of that. And so yeah, so you take all these things together, and you can end up kind of managing and mitigating a lot of that stuff that is really hard for new players in particular to get over that hump when it comes to like hardcore crafting games or hardcore survival games. Is we just have all these different features that kind of make it all work because there's always something else you can go do, right?
Yep. And with kind of like keeping the player engaged, that's another very interesting challenge when it comes to like survival crafters, even just like any kind of like open world nonlinear. Because you'll have people who, if you have, let's say, fishing, mining, and crafting, you'll have that one person who they will do all the mining and they will never touch the fishing or the
Yep.
crafting. You'll have someone who does one or the other two. And then some games will say, oh, in order to move the story along, you must, collect the 7 rare fish. So I hope you enjoyed fishing at some point, or you must now craft the ultra helmet. And it can be very frustrating for some people. And then, of course, you'll have the person who they'll do 100% of everything. They will go through your entire game and do every single subquest and plot line. With trying to keep the player engaged like that, what has been kind of like your thoughts of the methodology for, again, like giving the player lots of things to do, but not at the same time saying you must do each and every single one of these things?
Yeah, that's been one of the most challenging things to balance because we want players to engage with all the stuff we designed for them, right? And also we designed all of it to work well together. So if you do fully remove any of those components, or a player just doesn't want to engage with it, it changes the experience, right? And it moves away, further and further away from sort of our intended experience. So that's been a huge part of the challenge of designing this game is how do we make stuff as optional as possible so that players get to choose how they're engaging with stuff? Because that's also what gives you accessibility. That gives you, and it lets kind of players who are interested in given the variety of stuff going on in this game, players who are really into combat, like they can really focus on combat, right? Players who are into just kind of chill vibes kind of stuff, right? Can like mostly build their base and go do farming and fishing, right? But ultimately, there is a story, and there's boss fights positioned as you go through it,
Mhm.
and to engage with that content successfully, you're gonna have to craft some weapons and learn how to do some combat, right? And so what we try to do is figure out like what can we do so that if the primary thing we're trying to get the player to do is basically engage with the story and play through it and get to the end of the game, right? How do we do that where we let the player engage with all the other mechanics that make it up as not minimally as possible, but as kind of like light touch as possible from a requirement side, and just try to make it interesting so that they would want to at least try the thing out, right? And then we always identify the things that we're going to treat as kind of a lot more optional. So we're treating sort of fishing and farming as a lot more optional, so that I'm not even sure there's anything like in the mainline quest, that like truly requires that you engage with the systems very much. Um, and if there are, it's just like a little bit, right? Um, because like we identified what the core thing about the game is, which is basically an action adventure game, uh, where you're going through the story, right? And so we're making sure that that part is the main kind of driving force in terms of how we're designing the game, how we want it to feel, and the rest supplements that really nicely, but just isn't strictly required. And so I know, like for me, I've just finished my or almost finished my first full playthrough of the game, um, and I'm 50 hours in at this point, and almost at the very last boss fight of the thing, right? And I play as a completionist, so that's my gameplay style. I've like done every single quest, I've crafted every single item, like done all of that, right? And just barely touched farming. Just like didn't do it, right? And that meant that I had to go do more exploration and more, resource
Mhm.
harvesting than somebody who was really into the farming would have had to. But I just thought that was more fun and interesting, right? So for me, like going through the world and like dealing with combat scenarios and harvesting stuff was just more fun and interesting than doing farm stuff. But another person on our team uh, spent a lot more time. Like the moment they started to run out of something, they'd be like, "Okay, let me go farm that resource," right? And they would go set up a farm and do like the whole, and then figure out how to like. We don't have the automation in the game, but we have because you have like again, you've got these exploding plants and stuff, right? So you can kind of do pseudo automation where you can plant exploding plants, blow them up, they blow up your other resources, and then you can kind of harvest them, that way, right?
Mhm.
So these kind of elaborate, weird scenarios that people can construct just based on the part of the game that you're really into, because it still all lines itself up towards driving the player forward through the quests and through sort of the action adventure aspect of the game. Um, so yeah, I guess that's kind of the strategy, but it's a lot. There's a lot of components involved, uh, and figuring out how to make it so that the stuff feels good. It's not even necessarily that it has to feel optional or even is optional. It has to feel like it's optional, right? So that the player gets to choose some level of engagement with each aspect of the game, whether that's how much they're interacting with it, or when they're interacting with it, or how difficult it is to interact with that particular component. And so our strategy has basically just been to provide like a lot of layers to all of that to just make it so that even the stuff that truly is required to like get through all of it, you kind of get to choose when you're engaging with it. That seems to be a pretty successful formula. It worked pretty well in original Crashlands, even though all of it was a lot simpler. With Crashlands 2, there's a lot more going on, and it's the layers of that are more complex. But we just started our closed beta just a few days ago, and seems to be working as far as we can tell. We've got 100 players who are testing it, um, and they are engaging with it in all kinds of ways, including some very surprising ones that we're looking at and we're like, how could this possibly be fun, right? But they seem to be having a good time, and so it's cool to see that actually seem to bear out that it's very just sort of a kind of sideways strategy of just lots of variety of things at various depth levels seems to come together and work pretty successfully. But for certain players, it doesn't. It definitely doesn't, right? Because there is enough stuff going on that if you truly don't want to touch something at all, I think in the Crashlands franchise in particular, it's like if you don't want to touch combat, it's going to be really hard to like figure out how to make that work, right? Um, and but ultimately, we had to choose something. Choose something that was like there's a driving force that kind of this game is oriented around. We want to have broader access, and even if people aren't as interested in that thing, we want enough stuff to keep them going on that main thing. But ultimately, there has to be something, that kind of pulls everybody through.
And so about that something that takes me to the next question that I want to ask you. Well, to go back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about kind of giving the player more things to do over the course of playing the game. This is another, I think, challenge of like survival crafters and like this kind of particular genre is that for a while of them, I remember this with like Don't Starve, that as you go to various tiers, you're not really changing what the player is doing. You're just giving them
Yep.
more plays to juggle. Okay, I chopped down the normal tree. Now I can chop down the ice tree, and now I can chop down the fire tree, and now I have just like 20 different varieties of logs. I can then turn to 20 different varieties of other things. It's very similar to that of what I see in the automation genre as well, where once you kind of get your base established, it's just adding more breadth, not any more depth to it. So with
Yep.
kind of like moving through like Crashlands 2, like what are you guys doing in terms of I guess like keep expanding on things without like kind of completely just like overwhelming the player because that's the other downside when you
Yeah.
go too big.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, that's a spot on problem with it. And that's that aspect of like I said about the original Crashlands. At some point, kind of the progression system just kind of gets a little laid bare, right? Because exactly that thing happens. You progress through enough tiers, and at some point you're like, wait a second, I'm just getting swords that have bigger numbers. You know, yeah, they look different, right? And yeah, the area I got them from looked different. There were some creatures that I hadn't seen before there, right? Uh, but ultimately, that part of the game, the crafting, sort of in the RPG part of the game, gets kind of samey, right? And it's really hard to have that not happen. So with Crashlands 1, I think we mostly relied on just like having the world again, just like itself be interesting and deliver new creatures and stuff to you that have like very different combat kinds of things. And again, we relied on the story so that there was like interesting story stuff unfolding, weird boss fights you could run into, you know, that kind of stuff, right? So we would kind of be reaching to the other parts of the game to try to offset the fact that at some point the kind of core crafting fighting loop just gets a little bare, right? With Crashlands 2, we wanted to solve that a lot better, and so the strategy there was to really focus on interactions of things, and so that's what so we had that idea of like the world is already interacting with itself, so that creatures are fighting each other, they're eating resources. When they do that, things happen, right? And as you are working through the tiers of things, you don't always engage with like resources by chopping them down, right? Sometimes you'll have a weird two-step process where you have to like make a certain kind of a thing that like freezes that one, right? And then when it's frozen, then it gives you different kinds of resources than you got previously, or things that you can like hit and they get knocked into other things. And when that happens, some kind of a combinatorial effect occurs and then new things appear, right? Like there's a lot of this kind of stuff that's very bespoke. So there's not really a pattern that you could guess to it. So that as you go through the game, we just kind of drip these things in. And every once in a while, I'll put kind of a substantial one in that adds a new mechanic in some way that's a little more substantial. So that you're kind of getting drip fed just these weird interactions all the time. So that as you're going about in the world, it feels a little more like you're engaging with a world in a weird way, in a deeper way. And as you progress through the game, then you're seeing new stuff, but then also interacting with it differently. And what we at least found so far through our playthroughs is that this seems to have much more successfully than the original. Kind of pushed against that everything being laid bare process, right? Because it's not just the numbers got bigger, I can harvest this now and I couldn't before, right? It's I need to craft these things, and if I put these together, or if I throw this item and do some like weird splash effect onto this group of resources in the presence of this kind of a creature, then that creature will come over to those resources and do some stuff to it, right? And then some new things will appear. So it's like just kind of these weird sequences of interactions that we've added in. I know for me, for my playthrough anyway, that definitely it seems to have been the thing, you know, that like that kind of offsets the reality that at base it is still ultimately you make better stuff, get access to more stuff, make better stuff, right? Ultimately, it is the loop, right? There's like, and that's just kind of what most games are, is that power loop. And our goal is basically just how do we hide it? How do we hide that that's what's happening, so that it feels like something a lot more interesting is going on.
And with like that kind of loop of keep giving the player more things to get more cool stuff, to build more things, to get more cool stuff, what we see from a lot of the like open style games, and take this to more of the survival side of the survival crafter, there's always that push and pull between can the player get to that point where the survival side just goes away? That I have all the food, I have all the water, energy, whatever you need, and you know that whole part is done. Or do we go for something like hardcore, like what was it, the Lone Dark or the Long Dark, where you will always need food, you will always need some kind of heating source. Because you'll have different players who will approach these games very differently. Like with the Subnautica example, there are people who play that game on, you know, highest difficulty settings. They want the whole, you know, underwater survival thrill. You do have people play on pure sandbox. They just want to build undersea labs and bases. So with Crashlands 2, and this goes, again, back to what you're saying with the Surthrival side, which I will hopefully try and get this right by the end of our chat.
It's hard to say.
with that particular style, like how does the survival elements like eventually like go away? And if they do, like, do you have anything that kind of like, replaces them or like supplements them?
Yeah, well, that basically the way it works is because it's just not about survival. Then
Mm-hmm.
they're kind of just never there, you know. Or the way that they're there is in more of the action adventure kind of a sense, right? As in like as things get more difficult, you're interacting with more complicated terrain and creatures and stuff like that, right? And so engaging with things becomes requires more skill, becomes a little more difficult. You're likely to get damaged more, so you're crafting. So you're like crafting elixirs and healing items and and things that give you buffs and like you're doing all that kind of stuff that you would kind of expect, right? But not in a way that's meant to sort of defray like you're just being out in the world experience, you know? So you're not just constantly being harmed all the time, right? Like you're kind of always
Mm-hmm.
choosing when you're going to engage with the stuff that can harm you, right? And so we don't have to try to find a way to bridge that gap between because I agree with you. Like in a lot of games that have that survival element, at some point it's not survival anymore, which really means you have two games jammed together, right? You've got a survival game, and then you've got some kind of more like an RPG or action game, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really challenging to make a game that's two games, right? Uh, and it's also really challenging. Like late game stuff is always just so hard, right?
Yep.
Because every kind of loop, every kind of anything peters out or gets out of balance or whatever, right, as you engage with the game. Um, and by just not having that element in there, then we didn't have to try to figure out how do we have two games, right? And so yeah, so I guess that the short answer is we just didn't have to solve the problem by really just not having survival elements, right? Or the way that people think of it. I think a lot of it is that because survival and crafting and like kind of the open world vibe sort of thing all go together so much that we don't really think of Crashlands as a survival game at all. That was more cast upon it, right? If that kind of makes sense. Like when we launched the original Crashlands, it was perceived and treated as a survival game that just wasn't punishing. Um, and we just kind of never thought of it as being that at all. We thought of it as a crafting game or a crafting game that's also action adventure. And Uh, but it's got enough of the trappings of what people expect from a survival game that they can't help but sort of put it into that category.
Mm. And it's always that trick when it comes to kind of like the appeal of like marketing these kinds of games as well. Because, like I said, you'll have people who will want different things out of their survival crafter. And I guess to go with like the crafting side, this is something again like for fans of mine watching, they know how much I really, really enjoy having to craft the same things over and over again. And of course, durability on items, the greatest
Yep.
mechanic in all video games. I'm sure everyone can agree. But there are people who love like that particular style. So with like Crashlands 2, like in terms of like the crafting and like production side, how like is like easy or like streamlined is that?
Yeah. So that was one of the things that we were really doing with the original Crashlands was to if you go and like watch our old trailers for that game and stuff, it's really focused on those features, right? It was all about quality of life stuff because it's like I love the genre of crafting game. But the thing that always kicks me out at some point is inventory management and just
Mm-hmm.
the complexity of the sheer variety of things and how much of everything you need. Right? At some point, it becomes too much. And I can't anymore. Right. And that was kind of true for all of us. It was, we, a lot of the way that we approach game development in general is to say, what's a genre of game that we like at base or want to like, but there's something about the way it's typically done that just drives us nuts. Right. And so,
Mm-hmm.
so with original Crashlands, one of the big like even marketing sort of pitches we had. I'm not sure if it's successful as a marketing point, right? But what our big pitch was like, hey, it's a crafting game without inventory management at all, right? So we refer to it as an infinite inventory that manages itself, right? So you're just not playing that game of like being out in the world and be like, oh no, I'm out of inventory space, or coming back to base and where the first thing you do is now put a bunch of chests out, label them,
Mm-hmm.
we just got rid of all of that so that your inventory, the way that we, you know, the story way that we dealt with it is by, because it's sci-fi, right? So we just say you have a wormhole pocket that goes to your sort of goes to a warehouse of all of the stuff that you've been collecting as you go. So just infinite stuff. When you're then dealing with crafting and all of that, like you can't even open your inventory because it's got too much stuff in it. We don't even want you to deal with it, right? So
Mm.
you just collect stuff and then you go look at your recipes, and if you've got enough of the thing you can make, and it tells you if you can make it and how much you can make, right? So in the context in which you would care if you have the thing, you can see if you've got it. And we just left it at that. And we're doing the same sort of thing with Crashlands 2, where it's how do we have these systems, and some people do enjoy kind of like the management side of that, right? But that's one of the things that we couldn't figure out a way to make it not become unwieldy as the game progresses. And so we went back to leaning on the whole, well, let's just not do that and let people engage with all the other parts. And so what the game does do for making it so that all the crafting stuff stays like interesting, doesn't get overwhelming, all that kind of stuff, is as you craft things, you're kind of leveling up the crafting for that thing. So you kind of go through a progress thing of once you craft a certain amount of it, now they're a little cheaper. You craft a little bit more, it's a little cheaper yet. Craft a little bit more, you get like an extra one or two items, like that kind of stuff, right? So everything has a little sort of level up curve, and the more you make it, the cheaper it gets. And combining that with like the farming system and the fishing system that you can level up also, so that you can kind of decide how rapidly you want to get resources, right? And then how effective they are when you get them, means that as certain items in the game become more in demand because you've opened up a new tier of content, it all wants, bark from the certain tree or whatever, that as you're doing that, the stuff actually gets a little cheaper over time, so that it kind of is always taking about the same amount of overall time and effort to do stuff, even as like the amount of stuff you can do kind of keeps growing and expanding. Getting that thing balanced to feel really good is also a huge challenge because you've got all these resources just out in the world, right? So trying to balance that so that it's not requiring too many of this or too few of that or whatever is one of the things that we learned from the original. We just have to do algorithmically. So we just have an algorithm that basically looks at the map and tries to figure out what's out there and kind of how it's distributed, how many recipes use it, roughly when in the progression track those recipes become available, which is really hard because it's non-linear, right? So like roughly when, and then based on all of that, and then also then how hard it should be, right? So if it's a particularly powerful item, we're like, yeah, I should take some extra effort. So like there's like a little effort multiplier, right? And we take all that together and figure out, okay, here's how much of each resource you're going to need to make that thing. And that way we have like easy levers we can pull to just be like, okay, let's make everything a little easier, or let's make everything a little harder, or let's make these particular items, a little easier or harder. And we can then tweak that also by just changing some resource distribution and putting more stuff in a few places to kind of see what the algorithm does to change how stuff feels, right? But that is one of those things that absolutely, as you're progressing through the game, because it's just not very linear this time around. There's just all these surprises that we run into because we hand built the world that you're operating in and all the items that you craft, right? But that interaction between like how much of the thing that you need when it becomes available to you as a specific player, and what that means to you in terms of difficulty and time required to get it based on what other systems you're interacting with, is this enormous space of this huge balance range, basically, that we try to provide. Like, here's our natural path, we think, but by having all these levers the player gets to pull, they get to kind of choose actually just how hard it is to engage with any one of those things. But again, the whole effort was, how do we make it so that this kind of feels like you're getting new cool stuff as you go, but it never feels like it's exhausting to be like, oh, I have to go again to get this one resource, right? And that's the core piece of feedback right now during the beta test that we're like really looking for is when our players like, I'm getting so mad because every time I come back to craft stuff, I need more of this one, right?
Yes.
And then we can rebalance that lever a little bit for that particular thing. And we've been doing that continuously as we've worked on the game, so that it's in a pretty good spot. And the beta testers so far haven't complained too much about stuff feeling grindy, which is
Hmm.
that was the word itself. Like people talked about the original game again, 8 to 12 hours in. That was the adjective they started to use. Is like it's starting to feel grindy, and that's the thing we've been trying to avoid at all costs this time around.
Yeah. And like as another like pet peeve when it comes to like crafting, the ever popular, of course, as you said a few minutes ago, putting down 27 different treasure chests. You have to store everything in, but then the producing equipment stuff they don't take from the treasure chest. You have to remember, okay, which one
Yep.
of these treasure chests is that I have the carbon rod that I need to take for this
Mhm.
one thing? Oh, but now I forgot
Yep.
this. And
Yep.
to kind of grow on what you were saying a second ago about like kind of like the need for certain resources as the game goes on. This is, I think, another like very interesting challenge when it comes to progression in these games, especially again like the automation style games, where okay, I'm 20 hours in, but I still need to make sure I'm harvesting grass from like the
Yep.
most basic area while I'm still trying to build nuclear fission on the other side of the map.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
And some games have gone around this by, like, as you go further in, new stuff will just literally not need those resources. You'll never, when you get to like tier 5, you'll never need to worry about grass, wood, and stone. Some games I've seen kind of go with, okay, as you go further in, we're going to make those basic resources almost trivial to collect. We'll let you
Yep.
build the auto miner. He'll just go out and he'll mine 10 trillion rocks, and you'll never need
Yep.
to pick up a pickaxe again. With Crashlands 2, like, what has been like the approach to again, like introducing new resources and new things without just again like piling on? You now need to collect 70 different kinds of rocks
Yeah.
in the world.
Yeah, it's sort of it's basically the in between of the two sort of
Mm-hmm.
things you just said, right? Of making so that as you progress through, you are moving into kind of new tiers, and we do pull up resources a bit as you go, but at some point they fall off, right? So like the very early game resources that are only available in that biome, right? Uh, for stuff that gets unlocked in the next biome, like we don't make you use that stuff, right? Because it's now too far. It's now too far away, and uh, we still on occasion will if we just think it would be fun to do that, right? But in general, it's you do move out of certain kinds of the content. But then also it's that system where as you craft things with the craft particular things, we make the resource requirements cheaper so that any given resource becomes in essence becomes more available, right? The more you have to use it, so that if you do need to come back and use it again, it's just a really quick little harvesting trip. Just like
Mm-hmm.
you go on a quick route, knock some things down. You've already got enough to do whatever the thing is you were trying to do. And so trying to find that, trying to trying to ride that line of going in between those two things because we want it to feel like this stuff matters, the whole time. But practically, yeah, we don't want the player to go back to the beginning of the game every 20 minutes to harvest the same resource they've harvested every 20 minutes for 2 dozen hours. So trying to find a way to make that stuff stay useful for longer than like in the original and longer than is typical for a game that's going to kind of throw stuff away as it goes. But not so long that you feel like you're just doing the same stuff over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, it's hard to say. It's one of those things. It's like that's just a balance point, um, and it's also why we focus so much on how do we spread things out and kind of have things be a little more horizontal, so that as you're moving around the world, there are like the world is designed so that resources come in um, basically pockets, like so you'll go through a little region that's like mostly one kind of resource and that kind of thing. But there's always a little bit of the other stuff in there too, right? So that by the time you're in there, you'll just kind of incidentally get it, and it's probably going to be enough for whatever thing you're trying to do, right? So that we still get to kind of keep you engaging with all that stuff, but at a level that kind of decreases in proportion to also us demanding it less from you. So anytime you're introduced to a new thing, like it's going to take some effort, but the old things take less and less and less effort and attention as you keep on progressing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And one thing that we didn't talk about so far has been like the combat side of Crashlands. So
Mhm.
with combat in these kinds of games, again, like we've seen the whole spectrum of it. from like very like basic, you walk up, guys, we just do this for 20 minutes. There are some
Yeah,
that
yeah.
go more like ARPG, dodge rolling, ammo management, that kind of thing. So for people who haven't checked out the first game, like how does combat fall, or where does combat fall in Crashlands 2?
It's very movement and positioning focused. So Crashlands 2 is that's kind of the thing that has the most departure, I guess, from the original. Crashlands 1 is basically it's like a one touch, like Diablo-y kind of experience, right? Where
Hmm.
you've got like a hot bar with gadgets and things that have special effects and whatever, but you just kind of like you'll tap those buttons and you'll click on enemies and your character will run up and hit them, right? And then most of what you're trying to do is sort of like dance out of the danger zone, right? So the general the general design we have for all the combat is the enemy type. Every enemy type has some collection of moves that it can do, and it telegraphs them ahead of time. And then the animations match up so that you can kind of guess what it's going to do. Then you see the telegraph appear. You can learn the timings of things, right? So it's kind of like almost like a WoW raid boss kind of a vibe, right? Where you see where stuff is going to happen, right? And then you're trying to basically jump in, do an attack before it happens, trying to time your stuff against their stuff, right? So it's very this kind of timing based thing. The original we wanted to be overall that game is supposed to be pretty chill, right? So while this kind of combat thing is a core thing you're doing the whole time, the floor and the ceiling aren't that far apart for like what it means to be good at it or what it means to engage with it, right? And with Crashlands 2, we wanted those things to be a lot further apart. We wanted you to be able to still, like, if you're a player like me who's just not, like, I love the action adventure part, but mostly I care about just, like, the story, having fun harvesting stuff, like building my base. Like, that's the part that I have the most fun with. And so for players like me, where it's like, yeah, I like the combat, but I don't really want it to be hard. I want it to be just interesting enough that because it's a core part of the game, I don't get bored. So it's like I think it's got to be like just challenging enough, even though I don't really want to interact with it. That it's a good time, right? All the way up to both my brothers who do almost all of the actual design work, who are like really into pretty rough combat games. So one plays WoW and is like some top whatever person in his class, right? And then the other one loves Dark Souls and like those things, right? And so you're gonna see elements of that in there. But we were trying to figure out like how do we make a combat system that again very rich, but where the focus is on how do we create this huge range of engagement where you can come in like I did. I played it in so we have different difficulty modes, so you can kind of choose the overall level of difficulty that you're going to be confronting. So like I'm playing it in chill mode and not really like I was like barely paying attention to all the cool like synergies between items that you can get. That like if you have two of this thing, then now you get a speed boost when this happens. And like there's all this like really complicated, interesting stuff. Then if you're like into min maxing and making like just completely out of whack kinds of combat scenarios, then you can do that, right? You can do that and have a really good time trying to puzzle together just the weirdest combination of things that you could do, and then how you would engage with it, right? And so we do that through this really complex system of buffs and procs and all this kind of stuff. You're just like constantly engaging with this really dynamic system where you'll hit a thing, it'll add a buff. If you get 3 stacks of it, it explodes, whatever. So there's just like a lot of layers that you can engage with, but it's again very sideways, right? So if you're doing that with like kind of the poison track, that behaves one way. If you're going like a bleed kind of a track, it goes another way. But even within those, like every kind of weapon has its own set of buffs that are unique to it that do something else entirely, right? And so as a player who just like thinks the stuff is fun but doesn't want to deeply engage with it, you just get to have some weird stuff happen. It's kind of fun, right? And you can read these bizarre tooltips that describe these things that you can do. Just pick some stuff and go have a good time, right? But if you're really into it, you can just make these broken ass builds, right? That just are really weird and allow you just to kind of do chaotic, amazing things, like be way faster than we ever intended you to be for brief periods of time, that kind of stuff. And we're just kind of like letting that happen because that's part of the fun is allowing the player to again choose like is kind of everything going to be just a little hard all the time, but I don't have to like engage with it very deeply, right? Um, Or in my case, not that hard because I'm also playing in chill mode, so I don't have to engage with it deeply, and it's not that hard. It's just kind of fun, right? Or am I going to play in challenge mode, right? And then now I have to engage with these systems because if I don't, it's going to be impossible, right? Um, and but yeah, but at root, it's basically like the focus has been again on this like just doing stuff that's weird rather than just strictly like, yeah, this is better than that, so use that one, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so we have things where it's like you could go like down a life steal route, you could go down electricity, and then and you have also we have a pet system, and the pets also interact with that system too. So like it's just a lot of weird dynamic stuff going on that is we sort of intentionally didn't worry about balancing, right? We're just like, I don't know, each one of these things does cool stuff, and then we would play test it when a boss fight or something just to see like what it felt like, and if it was a really good time, then that's what we did, right? And that was basically it. So yeah, so we just kind of wanted all that stuff to be fun, so that if you played it, if you're really into like min maxing, and like you just want to win and you want to like be good at it, right? We wanted it to be the case there wasn't just a path that you would take
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, hey, here's the path where if you do this, you do the most damage, so do that, right? But instead, like, hey, if you're into playing a game and having this kind of experience, then here's the path you would go down, right? Because they're all viable, because they're all just kind of like weird and unique. Yeah, so that was kind of our core strategy this time around, with making combat fun.
And with like the kind of like different like passives and modifiers, is it a case where like the modifiers are like separate from the gear and you attach them, or do you have like different gear like this is the fire sword, this is the shotgun, so on?
Yeah, it's the latter
Okay.
case, where and so the original was more of the former, where every time you would craft a weapon, it would randomly kind of roll some stats on it, and there would be certain like kinds of things that were allowed, so it wasn't just anything, but there was a huge amount of sort of randomized diversity in what any given thing could do, and so that we were also using kind of it was the same concept we talked about earlier of like how do we give the player resource sinks to give them a reason to go do stuff, right? And what I'm is just recraft your items to re-roll them, basically, right? But this time we were, as part of our strategy, was everything should feel unique and good already without you having to do anything else. And so we basically have, I don't know, it's like 7 different kind of, you can think of it like elemental sort of types, right? That then go into sets. So any given item basically will fall, or a given like combat item will fall into one of those sets. And so it might be like electric focused or lifesteal focused or bleed focused or poison focused or whatever. And it'll kind of like fall into one of those. But the specifics of what it does within that are really variable and specific to that item. So that way if you want to like go all in on something, then you can kind of like put together an elaborate set, right? But even just swapping out one thing, even within the same set, right, is going to change the actual experience that you have doing it.
Yeah, and with kind of like giving the player like all these different options, one thing that we didn't touch on yet that I do want to ask you about is he kind of like is like the I'm not sure what we call it, like the coziness or kind of like the base building side. Was this is another
Yeah.
aspect of a lot of survival crafters that again you can talk to people and they'll have very different responses. Again, like for me, I just want if I need a bed, I'll just build the bed, the
Yep.
workbench. I don't need anything else. And then you'll have the person who will build the perfect 5-floor mansion with working plumbing and
Yep.
electricity. And there's very different approach to this. I've seen some games will kind of assign a value to different items. So, if you build the fancier bed, you'll get more rest, or you'll get better food if you eat from the dinner chair. And then there are games in that they don't care. Here's 87 different chairs, 47 tables, doors,
Yep.
wallpaper, do what you wish. With Crashlands 2, like, what are you guys doing in terms of, like, the base building or settlement side of
Yeah.
things?
Yeah. Yeah. It's again one of those like we're trying to make it so that the floor and the ceiling are both interesting, right? So and then let players kind of choose their level of engagement within that range. So original Crashlands bases didn't really do anything. You just kind of like you had to have just enough. Like you had to have a floor to put a workstation down, right? And so kind of like what you're describing, tons of players, including myself, would just slap the floor down, put a crafting station on it, and be like, "Cool, here's my base," and that's the end of it, right? Um, and since then, we played games like Valheim, and these are things that have these like really interesting base building systems that do add some layers of mechanics on top. Um, but as soon as you add in those mechanics, like an X level bed will give you more rest or whatever, then now it becomes a required component, really, right? Like
Yep.
you don't have to engage it necessarily, but then when you don't, then you're missing something substantial. So, so the strategy we took with Crashlands 2 is to kind of bring base building, basically make it so there were certain things you needed to do with base building to introduce you to the idea that it could be a fun to interact with, right? And that there was a wide range of stuff that you could do, and then slowly add stuff that you kind of had to do, but in a way that really just isn't that big of a deal if you don't really care that much, right? But then every time you do engage with it, like, oh, you might as well put some more stuff down while you're at it, right? Like when you crafted some floors, you made more than you needed because you get a bunch at a time, right? So might as well make that room a little bigger than you thought you needed to, right? And oh, now there's empty space. Might as well put some stuff in there, right? So basically, trying to leave room so that every time the player engages with it, they have an easy way to do stuff. Um, so so we took that and then made it so that the kind of the core thing that drives the base building as a required feature is your interaction with NPCs. So kind of like it's basically a lot like in Terraria, where as you go out and you find characters out in the world, then you can bring them back to your home base and you make a room for them. And then if they're in that room, they're happy, and then you can like interact with them and craft stuff or whatever, right? So we want to take that, but more of the Crashland style, where when you're engaging with those NPCs, it's in a much more involved story kind of capacity. So they've got their personal quest lines, and you help them do stuff. You have them follow you out of the world to go like see certain things or talk to other characters or whatever. So you have these like really long term, or the whole course of the game, quest lines with these NPCs. This like small subset of them, these like small subset of characters, and so we then added this comfort system where it's just basically like we've seen this in other games, right? Where you'll have that NPC will be like, in my space, I want the following things to be true, and if they're true, I'm happy, right? And so it's like I've got a big room, and I've got at least one lamp, but I've got I've got what. So it's like these kinds of sets of things that they want to make them happy that we've like lined up with the story, so it makes sense in a story context, and then evolve over time, so that as you interact with these characters and kind of build a space for them, become better and better friends with them, help them solve their problems. That's kind of going hand in hand with also you engaging with the base building system to basically try to like achieve these various goals. Because then when you do, all those NPCs do research for you to like unlock new things. And so they do it faster now. You get access to new things you didn't have access to before. So we've given you a reason to do that on top of just it's a fun story, and as you do, again, you're now just having to engage with the system just fairly frequently, but never in a really big way. So that every time you engage with it, you're just choosing like, well, I'm here, might as well do some stuff. And it's the same deal with our pet system, where you go find eggs out in the world or get them as a consequence of quests or whatever, and you get the egg and you gotta hatch it. And then we have kind of taken from Arc, right? Like an Arc, if you want to hatch an egg, it's like it's got to have the temperature right and all this kind of stuff. And so same idea, where we just say, cool, just apply comforts to eggs, right? So an egg says like, I want to be in a dark room by myself with no loud crafting stations, whatever, right? And so now you have to like go build a little quick like mini base just to hatch this egg, right? And what we've seen for like, I know my own experience, because like again in the original I didn't care about it because it didn't do anything, so I was like, I don't need to engage with this. Um, and this time around, the bases look way better than the original because they're more 3D, and there's a lot more kinds of stuff, and of course also the art's just better because it's been 9 years, right? So, so it's a much more visually and experientially compelling kind of a thing than it was before. But even still, I actually didn't think I was going to engage with it that much. But on my playthroughs, I just find myself just kind of like tooling around, just again, because we made it really really easy to basically to swap out what you're doing with your housing. Because that was the other thing, is we've all experienced that in various games that do have some base building mechanic, that if it's a pain in the ass in some way, if it's hard to do, or if it's really expensive to do because you can't just get your resources back when you put up a wall or whatever, uh, and so the mistakes are costly and all that, then you just kind of don't engage with it. And
Mm-hmm.
so we try to make it as easy as possible to engage with, and just there's no punishment of any kind for engaging with it. It's not cheap necessarily, and I got to spend resources to craft all this stuff, but it's also not overly expensive. So that like as you're out in the world doing stuff, you're just going to end up every time you open your crafting menu being like, I could go make 20 floors right now. Like I don't need to, but I could, and I'm not using this resource anymore because I've the stuff that I'm focused on of like my weapons and stuff don't need this stuff anymore. But the crafting system can use it still, right? And so it basically becomes like simultaneously a resource sink, a reason to go engage with those stuff that you've otherwise left behind, and just an engaging, interesting thing that you can go do and kind of play with. And so then when you're building for yourself and for these characters that you're kind of friends with, and through that comfort system, we're already thematically making it so that you're setting up kind of rooms that thematically match that character because of the things they ask for. And you can do it in the bare bones way where you're just like, yeah, the rest of your room looks like this, but I'm going to throw this really out of place lamp in here because that's what you wanted, right? But every time you do that, it makes you as a player be like, I don't know, this looks a little incongruous. Maybe I should like spruce this place up a bit, right? And so you don't have to, but there's this like little sort of self-satisfaction incentive that gets added in. And it turned out to be really successful, at least for us playtesting it. Where we have yet to see, once we get our playtests all done, I'm going to ask all of our testers for screenshots of their home base to see what it has become, over the course of their playthrough. But it seems to be a pretty effective way to make all that work.
Mm-hmm. And like with like the base itself, in terms of like the structure of Crashlands 2, is like the world like segmented like different areas, or is it just like one just like massive area? Like you always will return to like a central home base.
Yeah. So in the original Crashlands, we had basically three distinct biomes that you
Mm-hmm.
actually kind of teleport to. So we sort of took the pattern of we were kind of looking at like the way that, because like it's about like exploration and adventure, right? So in that game, we took that model of like how animals basically forage and stuff, where they have a central home and they kind of go out in loops,
Mm-hmm.
right, into kind of new areas. They go deeper and deeper as they run out of resources or need to find something new, right? And so in original Crashlands, it's like a radial system where it's all procedurally generated, but in this radial pattern. So as you go out, you get introduced to new resources, new sort of environmental sort of subtypes, right, and new creatures. But you can kind of go out in any direction, and it doesn't matter because it's basically a distance problem. Um, and then for the fully new biomes, we just kind of like have a teleporter system where it's basically loading a new world in effect to get you to fully new places. Um, we wanted Crashlands 2 to feel a lot more, real, I guess, to feel like more like a real
Mm-hmm.
place. And so it's all hand assembled and designed to kind of have, again, these more storytelling kinds of experiences about what the world even is that you're going through. And that also gave us the chance to, because now the world is more information dense. Because, the thing with randomness is that it's definitionally noisy, like it's there's a low amount of information basically in randomness because everything has to kind of work. But when you're handcrafting something, it can be very information dense, which means you don't need as big of a space. And so that allowed us to basically make a much more designed overall experience, which then meant that we didn't have to be like, practically, technically, we just have to move you to a fully new place of the loading screen, right? To get to the next full set of content. And we can instead just have it be one world that you start in and that you work through and move through.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one place. So it's basically gated by uh, either traversal mechanics that you have to unlock over time, or by huge boss fight compounds that you have to get through to get to the next area, whatever. So it's still gated like a classic kind of level design style thing, just on a 2D sort of world. Um, but it's all one place that you work through over time. You just have your sort of central home point, but you have a teleporter network that you unlock as you find things, and it's really easy just to kind of zip around, which we also found we just needed because since the game kind of is opening up in parallel all the time, then at any given time you might have like 6 or 10 quests just kind of like sitting there that you could work on, but each one is in a different part of the world, right? So it needed to be really easy just to kind of like zip around and go to wherever you wanted to go. And as soon as that was true, you might as well just make it so that it was easy to set up your homestead as that focal initial point and not make you move anywhere.
Mhm.
You still could, like you could pick up stakes and end up somewhere else if you wanted to, right? But we wanted to have that central part because that was also something that we noticed in the original too, is that in terms of incentives of like why build a base if you're going to teleport to a whole new world and then start over, right? So this way, like you can get really elaborate with like the stuff that you're building and how all of it works together, and not be constantly like, oh god, I have to travel so far, to do the next thing.
Mhm.
And yeah,
Mhm. And to clarify for people listening, is the world Crashlands 2 is it procedural generated or is it handmade?
it's all handmade this time
Okay.
around. Yeah, yeah, which is another part of why it's taken so long to do all of this stuff. Yeah.
All right. I'm trying to think if there's any other design related questions I have for you, Adam. Anything else regarding the development of the game that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to discuss?
There's just so much stuff. This is it's been a long, long project. From my own focus is always on the very background technical stuff, rather than on the design things. So there's not anything that comes to mind really, obviously, that we haven't already hit. Um, I think you did a good job of kind of covering like the core things that go into this kind of a game. Um, yeah, I think we kind of hit all the big ones.
Okay. So I guess just a few more quick questions for you, and then we'll kind of go into our wrap up. For people watching slash listening to us right now, in terms of like building, like this has an open world or Surthrival crafter that kind of thing. What has been like I guess like the most challenging aspect of it?
I would say the two parts are just scale. That's just the sheer amount of content we need is so high. Like I said, 150,000 words. I don't remember the last count, but it's like 2,000 unique art assets. It's just a lot, and we're a small team. We have one full time artist who brought another one on for just the last year to juice that because it was just we were falling so far behind. One full time writer, one full time game programmer, right, and then trying to make this big of a project is just some point it's just a volume game, So that's been one of the biggest challenges, definitely. But the other piece of it is given the volume and how complicated we needed everything to be, and I guess not complicated, complex is probably a better word, right? But how
Mm-hmm.
interactive we needed everything to be, and how much effort we put into making it so that it wasn't a linear process of throwing stuff away. Meant that dealing with the fact that nothing is linear is, but it still needs to feel good whenever you do engage with it, has been just an enormous challenge. And so we've developed a lot of tools with this whole like progression mapping system that tries to like based on how things depend on each other. It's a huge dependency tree, right? Of thousands and thousands of things of various types, quests and items and creatures and characters and whatever that and areas, right? Like locations on the map that are all networked together in this just huge, super complicated spaghetti thing, right? And so figuring out how to model that in a way that we can reason about and then use it to ask and answer questions about like, well, the player have seen the stuff here. How much damage should this thing do, right? Like, uh, is this going to be too hard at this point because of the given the variety of ways a player could have gotten here? Is it fair to basically say like, well, yeah, this is going to be hard if you didn't engage with this other stuff that is technically optional, but that we think players will engage with? Trying to make all that stuff mesh together in a way that is going to be a good experience for the vast majority of players, given the variety of ways they can end up coming at it, has just been enormously challenging. So that's the hard part, definitely.
And like to what you're just saying about like appealing to different kinds of players, that again is I think one of like the biggest parts of like this kind of design is the overall difficulty of it. You've been saying throughout the cast that there are different difficulty settings in Crashlands 2. So like, what does like I guess like what's the difference between playing the game on like the easy mode versus like the hard mode? Like, does that impact like just the combat? survival or crafting or a little bit of everything?
Yeah. So the idea is that the elements of the game that are basically like the story and the crafting and like basically your interaction with the world and the story, we think of as being kind of decoupled from difficulty, right?
Hmm.
So we don't think that it's something is more difficult if it takes longer, you know. So as the
Hmm.
difficulty goes up, we don't make things cost more, you know,
Oh.
right? So all that stuff stays the same. So the difficulty is really focused on uh, what kind of a it's basically focused on the question of like real time challenge, like skill, basically. So if you want this to be a skill based sort of component of like what your gameplay experience is, that's really what the difficulty hits. So things like we have a fishing mini games, right, that can get pretty hard. And then you've got your combat, and those are the kind of the core things that are like skill based, right? Um, and also the interactions with the world that are a little more punishing. So, like I mentioned, we got exploding plants and that kind of stuff, right? So like the timer on an exploding plant, right, is another example of like if you're just out trying to hang out in the world, but you do have to fight stuff to progress the game at least a little bit. Then want to make sure that like if you want that to be a pretty chill experience, that you're not getting blown up by plants and whatever. So it's things like increasing timer durations on hazards, right? So that they give you more of a warning before the effect happens, decreasing the radius of the
Hmm.
effect a little bit, making the fishing mini game like reducing the speed of everything a bit, on the easier modes. And then in combat, it's basically all about speed of stuff because again, the game is all about timing. It's just where you are getting into the right place at the right time, getting in, making an attack, keeping an eyeball on your health bar as your weird effects are all occurring, right? Just to make sure that they're timing properly. Uh, and the idea with the easier modes then is that we can kind of just slow all that down. So we don't really change the damage. We mostly just change like just every the creatures are a little slower and you're a little faster, right? Like that kind of stuff. So that core mechanic that makes it actually challenging then just becomes a little less challenging. And then conversely, because it's all balanced around our sort of adventure mode, the main mode. And then challenge mode just does the opposite. It just makes everything a little faster, but it's all based around the thing that we think makes it challenging. It's not just not pulling all the levers to basically say like everything just takes longer and is harder, right? But it's instead like very laser focused on if someone says I'm looking for a challenge, what do they mean, right? They don't mean I want it to take a long time to craft stuff. They mean when I go fight something, I want to have to think about it and get good at it, right?
Hmm.
Versus having a chill experience, what does that mean? It means I want to focus like it doesn't mean they don't want to do combat, right? It means that they don't want to have like this complicated skill curve that they're working up. They want it to still be fun and challenging, but in a way that they don't have to put a ton of learning into a lot of frustration of like things going wrong all the time, that they don't have to like engage with fully. So that's been our strategy there.
All right. And I think with that, I am just about out of questions for you, Adam. This has been a really great chat. It's always fun to talk about like this kind of crafting design.
Yeah, cool.
Let's see. So I guess one final thing from you then before we kind of go into wrap up. So anything else you would like to mention about Crashlands 2? Anything and everything, and then if not, we'll kind of wrap things up.
Yeah, I mean the main thing is it's coming soon. It's on April 10. We're launching on Steam and mobile, and so it's kind of going to be if in all likelihood if you've got a device you can play it when it comes out. So it's coming in hot. I'm very excited about it, and I mean that's really the main thing. It's just that it's coming.
All right. So, with that, I think we'll wrap things up for our conversation. And if you or anyone else from Butterscotch are interested in coming on for another chat, let me know.
Sure, yeah.
Right. So, you already mentioned the date for when Crashlands 2 will be released. So, in terms of social media, anything you want to mention, promote, stuff like that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the main thing is, there's just Crashlands 2. You can find it at crashlands2.com or our main website, bscotch.net. So that's B, the letter B, and then scotch like the booze, right? bscotch.net. And our other games there too. We got some good games. And our Discord is there. And we have a podcast we've been doing for our 500th episode was on January 1st this year, just by weird happenstance of timing. So if you're into the how the saucer's made stuff, specifically about our games, because that's what it's about, then could be fun. And if you're looking for me specifically, if you go to adamcoster.com, that's where all my social media stuff is and all that. You can track me down there. And Blue Sky is where I'm the most active. I'm not very active anywhere, but that's currently where I'm the most available.
All right. And it's time for my favorite question that causes dread in so many developers. With the Crashlands 2 coming out in about a little under 2 months as we're recording this, do you have anything planned for what's coming next after Crashlands 2?
I think this is one of those that it would fill me with dread if I could even think about it at all. It's so what I can say is that the next thing is not Crashlands 3. I can say that with almost complete certainty because Crashlands 2 was hard enough. It's taken so long. We're going to need a break of some sort. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means we make another game, take a hiatus. I have no idea. But we're just going to need a break after this one. But really, it comes down to just how well does the game do, right? Because as anybody in the industry is aware of, success is really random. And the range of success is enormous, and it operates over orders of magnitude, right? Back when we launched original Crashlands, it was shortly, I think it was just before our round anyway, when Stardew Valley came out, right? And compare it's like 2 indie games made by, in one case, one guy, in our case, 3 people, small teams, games took a few years to make, right? And then Stardew Valley was like 20 times more successful or something like that than we were, right? And there were other games that launched around the same time that like people would say comparable to any of these other games, right? That did 10 times worse, right? So it's just such a crapshoot, and you have no idea what the possible outcomes are going to be. And so for us, it's always for every game launch we've ever had. We do some scenario planning where we say, okay, if the outcome is this, then maybe here's what we do. If the outcome is that, maybe here's what we do, and so on, right? Because we just can't guess. And this time around, we're just so tired we haven't even done that. we're just waiting to see what happens and hoping that Crashlands 2 turns out to be a big hit and we can just not think about it for a little bit and then decide what we're going to do next, and otherwise really hoping we don't hit that bottom part where we can't keep funding ourselves, because in that case, that really makes it challenging to decide what happens next. So one of those, who knows? I have some ideas like what I would like to do, next. But I think everybody in the team right now has their own opinion about what the next thing is, and none of us have the energy to fight about it. And it's we know too little about what the future is going to look like to really guess anyway. So, yep.
That, I guess my final question for you before we get going is, anything you would like to say to the fans watching to take us out?
I guess if a lot of game devs are people who are into game dev, so the main thing is just keep making cool stuff. This is a cool industry. It's a cool job that we have, and it's rough. It gets really rough sometimes, especially right now. But it's cool. It's cool to make weird stuff that people get to go experience and enjoy. So keep doing that, or start doing that.
All right. Well, I think with that, we'll say goodnight. And yeah, I'll be looking forward to checking out Crashlands 2 in a few months.
Thanks for the chats.
Yeah, not a problem. So for everyone watching this, be sure to wishlist the game, check it out. You'll find links to everything Adam mentioned down below. So with that, from my side, be sure to do the YouTubing stuff, check out the Discord, Patreon, buy all the copies of my books, etc., etc. And once again, if you are a developer working on a game and want to come on the chat about it, or the perils and loves of game design, game dev, please reach out. I'm always looking for guests. So, again, Adam, thank you so much for coming on, and best of luck with wrapping up Crashlands.
Thanks a lot.
So, with that, everyone, come back for the discussions on game design here, and on game wisdom, where you see some of the art and science of games. Until our next chat, have a great night.